Good to come back together again for a keynote, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Isabel Dos Santos to talk to us a bit about, I guess, her vision of what Made in Africa means. I'm not going to go into the full biography. You've got it in front of you, but I suppose suffice to say you've run some big companies in different fields over the years, and are currently putting your time into the oil, the national oil company. But let's just take a step back and again, I guess start with the big picture, which is, when I talk to a lot of people about Africa, they kind of keep saying things to me like, has Africa beaten the resource curse? And that whole rising Africa narrative of a few years ago looked great when resource prices were rising. We're now seeing it. The flip side of that. Tell us about what's happening from your perspective.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for having me, and I want to thank also London Business School for inviting me here. Say hello to everybody. You're right. It's a challenge. I mean, we are growing now slower than we were 3-4 years ago. Commodity prices are down. So what do we do? What are our challenges? But at the same time, when you look at Africa, I mean, we are a blessed continent because we're full of commodities. They just naturally are there. So can we then say that we're not going to explore them? Probably not. Then you mentioned we have been resource-driven. That's true. But when we look at commodities, we have two types of commodities. We have the hard commodities, so we'll think about the mining and different mineral resources. But we also have the soft commodities, which is all the agricultural-based commodities. And I think on those ones, especially on the soft ones, on the soft commodities, there's a lot of work that we can do. And the reason why I feel that very strongly is because we have a very good internal market. So we have a growing population, we have a growing middle class. All this middle class is consuming, and we need these products, these agricultural products, for our own consumption. And currently, many of the countries are still importing a lot of the agricultural goods.
So the point was made earlier this morning about Nigeria, and in fact, it's a point that often gets made to me by Nigerians, is that the fall in the oil prices is actually a bit of a blessing rather than a curse, because it's forcing Nigerians to look at themselves and say, all of that stuff, from toothpicks to wheelbarrows that we used to import, we can start making for ourselves. I mean, is that a view that has gained traction in the other big oil economy on the continent?
Well, like a Chinese saying says, in all crisis, there's an opportunity. And you're right. The oil sector has been so predominant in countries like Angola and Nigeria that in a way it kind of hacked a little bit of our attention. We have been very focused on the oil sector and the oil services, and it has been a very dominant player in our economy. Today, that the oil sector is a lot less influential. There's more opportunities for private sector and more attention also given to private entrepreneurs to go in and diversify and to produce new things. You mentioned toothpicks. Well, I was reading a funny story this morning which was about tomatoes and tomato paste, and how both in Angola and in Nigeria, tomato paste is still imported. Well, isn't that wow? I mean, that we're importing tomato paste from California or from Italy. Can tomatoes not grow in Africa? Can we not make our own tomato paste? So maybe now we'll have time to focus on those things and realize that there are real opportunities and that they make money too. That's the other thing, is people have to remember, yes, you can make money in other sectors that are just not the oil sector.
So in fact, let's stick with tomato paste, because it is such a big issue, and I can see the Nigerians in the room are laughing because Mr. Dangote has in fact been putting a lot of money into tomato paste in the past few years.
That's great to hear that.
I think he's been a bit unlucky. That I believe who can correct me from Nigeria? I believe that the day he was ready to open his factory, there was some tomato disease, and unfortunately all the tomatoes in the area died, so he's had to kind of start over a bit.
Hopefully they grow very fast. They only take about 6 weeks to grow to 8 weeks, so maybe that was a very short moment in his...
Let's stay with, go back to Angola, which is just really, there are these opportunities, whether it's tomato paste, whether it's whatever. What, can big businesses be doing? What can, big oil companies be doing? What can the government be doing to really stimulate growth?
I think for me, one of the biggest drivers to stimulate the internal market is undoubtedly getting our retail to be much more modern. So modernizing retail, modernizing distribution. And why do I mean by that? Well, think about Europe. If you go back in the 80s or 70s when these massive hypermarkets and supermarkets started growing, what impact did they have to the small farmers and producers? Well, they were able to come to these producers and say, look, you're growing potatoes or lettuce or milk. I will buy a certain part of your production and I'll guarantee that you have a certain amount of income. So in a way, that gave the producer an incentive to go and to produce because he knew that he could then sell his production off to a hypermarket or supermarket that would be distributing that. So this is a model that we've taken into Angola. I've launched a project about 6 years ago. It was a difficult project to build because, let me not hide it, it is very expensive to build modern infrastructure, retail infrastructure in Africa. It's costly. You have to buy land, you have to build buildings, you have to put warehousing, logistics. So it's not an easy feat, but it is possible. And so we went ahead, we created a project. It's called Candando. It's a large-scale retail supermarket. And one of our first concerns is, okay, so we've built this big hypermarket. Now, how do we fill it in? Do we do, as in the past, import containers, go and get Forex licenses and import food and sell? Or do we think different? And we said, let's think different. So we went ahead and we spoke to about 300 local producers, different kinds of growers, people that grow from aubergines to cucumbers, sweet potatoes, to fishermen, or people who raise cattle, chicken. And we gave them kind of a futures contract. So they have a off-taker for their produce. Now, you'd be impressed how much their production just grew. Just over the last year, because we've only been open for about a year, their production is now doubled. And we have a lot more interest. So we started off with 300 people in this club, which we call the Producers Club, and now we're just doubling the numbers and having more and more people interested in this program.
I mean, so that is really interesting. So you're providing them with a kind of guaranteed offtake. You're giving them a market. What else did you have to do to help get them producing to the kind of quality and scale that you needed? I mean, how much?
Well, I'm happy you come to that question because, I mean, this is a question where you say, well, I want to produce chickens, but then I don't have corn. And then the guy who wants to produce corn says, I want to produce corn, but I don't have the fertilizers. So, of course, there's a whole issue of the supply chain. And yes, today in many African countries, if you look at the supply chain, which is going from land to plant to protein to shelf, there are links that are still missing. But at the same time, that's an opportunity, because if you don't have fertilizers, maybe that's an opportunity for you to set up a fertilizer company. Or if there's no corn, maybe that's an opportunity for you then to be the corn grower that supplies the guy who sells the chicken. So even though we have missing links in the supply chain, at the same time, we should look at them as opportunities, especially because there are some that are real money makers.
Yeah. So again, just filling in on some of the conversations we had earlier and some of the issues people raised, a lot of this is about, if you've got a small business that may be doing the corn or the fertilizer, very difficult to get bank financing, very difficult to get a bank to even look at it. If you can then get them to look at it, difficult to get affordable finance. In your experience, sort of how many of those barriers were out there when you looked at building these supply chains and helping people?
Well, I really like the way you use the word small. And yes, they are small, but they're not that small. If we look at the tendency, for example, here in Europe, when you had the crisis, some of the southern European countries like Portugal, Spain, and Greece, what happened to a lot of young graduates and people who were working in finance or in consultancy firms, some of them they no longer had a job, no longer had an opportunity to work in the city, and they decided to go back and start, for example, organic farms. Right? And they've been successful and they're making money out of that. So when we're looking at these farming models that I'm talking about, I'm not necessarily talking about your small farmer. I'm talking about cash crops. I'm talking about building a small business where you could end up having 100, 200 employees, where your turnover could be a few $1 million a year. So this is kind of a more structured approach to production. Yeah. And this has to be led by people who are educated. So we need to have people who are educated, who now realize that agriculture is a moneymaker. It is an opportunity. We can make money out of it.
a lot of what you've been talking about has been local sourcing into supermarkets. Again, tying back to another theme that we discussed earlier, was really about getting intra-African trade going. And we all know it's too low. And in fact, there is a great little anecdote that the former president of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, once told me about trying to get trade going between Nigeria and Angola.
Yep.
And his story goes that he led a trade delegation, a government delegation. They went down, they said, what can we sell you? And the Angolan said, we want Indomie noodles. I don't know if you've got them yet. I don't know if they're there, but the famous Nigerian noodles. And he said, that's great. He went back to Nigeria. He said, okay, we make these noodles. How do we get them to Angola? And everyone said, well, Mr. President, there aren't any ships that regularly travel between, between Lagos and Luanda. And he said, well, what do you mean? There are no ships in all of... And I said to him, well, so if you go down to Calabar, there are a couple of pirates and smugglers who may take some noodles down for you. And he had to say, well, we can't sell noodles to... But so the point of the question is, you've looked at local. How much are you looking at the region?
So when you look at local, you definitely build local business. And the tendency for that local business, once they have a guaranteed offtake, is to grow. I mean, if these are good entrepreneurs and they're active and they're full of energy, they'll grow their business. And once they start growing their business, I believe that they will not only be selling to us, but they'll be trying to sell to other people. And export is the next step. So as an example, further, for example, we have a supplier of pineapples who is now currently exporting the pineapples. We have a supplier of bananas who started by being our supplier and is currently doing 20 containers every month of bananas over to Europe. So in a way, it's a comfort when you have a local off-taker that already guarantees all your fixed costs. And then that allows you, and you can go to a bank and say, look, I have a guaranteed contract, I have a local off-taker. The bank can also help you grow your business. And as your business grows, then you can look at the next step, which is, who else can I sell to? And of course, exporting is the natural step. Should you export to your neighboring countries? Absolutely. I mean, for example, we're buying meat from Botswana, and it's coming by truck. We are buying produce from South Africa, and it's coming by truck. So yes, it's possible. Fortunately, the infrastructure in Africa has improved greatly. If you look over the last 10 years, many African governments have improved their infrastructure and have committed a great deal of money on updating the ports and improving the road and rail network.
Great. I'm going to go to the floor in just a minute. So get your questions ready, and if the people with the roving mics can get themselves ready. I'm just going to go back and ask you one or two more questions before we do that, which is really wearing your hat as chairperson of Sonangol, the national oil company. And I guess when oil prices are high, and a lot of money is being made, it is not difficult to run a big oil company. And I guess, but as the tide goes out, as they say, you see who's left swimming naked. And I'd like to get a sense of what are the kind of changes that you're having to now effect to really drive those efficiencies that perhaps 3-4 years ago weren't that important.
Well, Jonathan, I have to say that I was probably unlucky, and I never got to run the oil company when it was full of cash and doing extremely well. So I was brought in to Sonangol about 9 months ago. Me and a new board, we were appointed back in July 2016, and we came in as a new board. I came in because I come from a business background. I've had extensive experience in different domains, from retail to industry, to banking, to media, to telecom. And I've been managing companies for a long time, starting them from small, building them up, really going through every single stage of what it takes for a company to be successful. I've always said that I've failed quite a few companies, so it's normal to fail. It goes with the territory. And when Sonangol became a challenge for the government was very brave, and they did something fantastic, which is to say, okay, we have this great asset, great corporation. It has always been a provider of wealth to us, but how can we think different now that the oil prices are down and now that we're facing this downturn? How can we make it more efficient? How can we make it more modern? And so they called in a new board that mainly came from IOCs and, like myself, from the private sector, to kind of restructure and rethink the corporation. So our first challenge was really a cultural challenge, because when you want to change a company, the first thing you have to do is to understand, how do people in that company view the company? what do they feel about it, and how do they think they can change the company? So our first challenge was really the culture change. And the culture change was that we were initially a public company, there was a service provider, we were a large employer. So issues like performance, merit, profit, they were not at the center of our business. That was not what our company is about. So the first step was really to get the organization to focus on how do we deliver more profit, how can we become more transparent in our communication with our stakeholders, that's extremely important, and then how can we then become better performance? And then creating obviously a merit structure inside the company, so only those with true capabilities should be placed at the highest level. So that was also a big change from the past. And hopefully all of that will translate into positive results.
And if one looks at the kind of transitions that other big oil companies have had to go through, state-owned oil companies, I suppose Saudi Aramco is the prime example. I mean, in some cases, that they've been saying, let's bring in some private investment and the like to try and bring in that discipline of the market. Is that at all on your agenda at the moment, or?
Yeah. Well, when you look at NOCs like Aramco, Sonangol, or the National Oil Company of Malaysia, or so, when you look Petronas, when you look at several companies, what you'll see is, as these companies tended to do very well, they had a very diversified portfolio. So they had excess amounts of cash, and they went ahead and they committed to a number of investments. A lot of those investments were not necessarily in their core business. They were not necessarily oil and gas. So they diversified and they invested from real estate to logistics to transport to power production, agriculture. And now that these companies have less cash and that they really have to look at their bottom line, well, obviously refocusing back on what they should do and do well, oil and gas becomes key. So what we're doing now, for example, at our company is really refocusing back on the core business and oil and gas, looking seriously at oil and gas opportunities, and being a lot more criterious when evaluating those opportunities. In the past, there was like kind of an oil frenzy. When oil at $100, it didn't matter. All you wanted to do is produce oil. Today, all the oil investors are a lot smarter. They say, we don't want to produce at any cost. We want to produce at the right cost. So we need to have the right development project. When we're going to develop a field, we have to be careful that the amount of investment we commit to the field is the right investment. We should not over-invest. And once we're going to run the field, how can we run it very efficiently? How can we have the correct OPEX cost so that then we have the right price per barrel? And what's great, I think the whole industry has kind of come on board on that, and we're all aligning on this one.
Great. I could keep going, but I'm gonna have to discipline myself, so it's your turn.
All right, good afternoon. My name again is Shay. I'm from Macon Group, and I'm an LBS alum. Whether for good or for bad, it seems that the era of hydrocarbons, oil and gas is coming to an end. And I'd like to know if, whether it's Angola or Nigeria or Gabon, if we haven't missed out on a big opportunity now that this era is fading away. In essence, what I'm trying to ask is, where are the Mobils and the Chevrons and the Shells that should have come out of Africa in the time that we had this boom? Or whether it's Petronas or Petrobras, which are state-owned companies. We don't seem to have any of those. And then the follow-up question will be, is that not an underlying indication of a bigger problem? So that by the time we move away from the hydrocarbons and move into something else, will we still be unable as a continent to produce giants that compete with other countries in whatever these industries are?
Great, thank you. There was another one here in the same row.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Abdul Malik Alawi. I come from Morocco. I'm the CEO of the Huffington Post North Africa and La Tribune Afrique. I have a very simple question and one-sentence comment. What are you doing at Sonangol in order to build an ecosystem of suppliers and small companies that would work with you in order to create more jobs and create a dynamic of companies that might be able to fast-track development and industrialization of Angola. And the comment is about the tomato. In Morocco, we're the largest supplier of tomato, largest exporter of tomato in Africa. But the tomato is made, 80% of it is made out of water. And in Morocco, we subsidize water. So basically, we're printing money and exporting it to Europe. So sometimes, you know, growing the food chain is very good on paper and on PowerPoint, and I can tell you this because I'm a former strategy consultant. But in some ways, what are the real comparative advantages? And sometimes it's better to focus on extractive industries and bring out some stuff that would create more added value and not just look at the short-term value that we can get from the tomato industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There were two questions here. So over there and over there. So who's, okay, let's go there first, man with the beard.
Hello, my name is Marcello. I have a quick question, more to build on top of the diversification comment. I spent the past couple of years working and supporting most tech and innovation entrepreneurs on the continent, and I've worked in Angola quite a bit as well. And I was just curious on your view of that kind of emerging tech and innovation ecosystem that's coming in Angola, and how it can impact, you know, big companies like yours, and how you can work with smaller entrepreneurs in big companies, but also how these people can start transforming a country that's, you know, fairly focused on one specific type of industry. Thank you.
Great, and then question number 4, a woman over here with the long hair.
Hi, so before coming here, I think I've heard your name, and it's always associated with all sorts of rumors and prejudice given your unique background. And today I must say I've seen you, hearing you speak, and all those rumors are gone. Because, yeah,
Thank you.
seriously. So I'm curious, it's more about your personal growth, because I don't think we chose our family. And guess what? There are certain successful family politicians like Singapore, where family doesn't necessarily mean bad governance and everything. So I'm curious, just sorry, my question is really messy. Just you as a female leader, business owner, and also potential leader for the country. So how do you break all those barriers and get away from those rumors and become who you are?
Great, thank you very much. So, do you want to start at the top or the bottom? Or?
I think we start at the top.
There we go.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. You asked me about the IOCs and how come we don't have African-owned IOCs. Well, I'll tell you what, I share your vision. I think we should have some. And the good news, I think we will have some. So when you look at the oil sector is a very, it's been around for a long time. You know, it's probably been around for over 150 to 100 years. And you look at a company like ours, Sonangol, we've only been here for 4 decades. We're 41 years old. I'm not sure how old is the National Oil Company of Nigeria. Maybe somebody can help. How old is 50 years old? Yeah. So when you compare, you know, we have NOCs that are about 5 decades old compared to the big American oil companies. They're maybe 100 years old. So it's a question of time, one, for the NOCs. And for the IOCs is similar. But it's also a question of drive. Setting up an IOC is difficult. So setting up an oil operator is difficult. It's also tremendously expensive. So we need capital. And the great news, what I heard today, is that the banking in Africa is growing, insurance is growing, pension funds are growing. So all of these sources are going to be African sources of funding, and hopefully will be chaired and led by African people. And I believe that the IOCs in Africa will happen. So hopefully you can start one up, and we'll see you there. Yeah. And then the other question is whether, I'm not quite sure whether we mixed a big opportunity and whether we can still have African giants. I think absolutely. So to go to Brazil, and as an example, well, everybody knows Havaianas, yeah, those little flip-flops, yeah? And that's a giant. And when you look at Brazil, and I don't know how many people have been to Brazil, but look at the infrastructure in Brazil. Is it that much better than in Namibia or in Ghana or in Nigeria? Probably not, probably around the same. How were they able to produce a giant like Havaianas? Or for example, if we look at their chicken company, They have one of the world's largest chicken companies. How were they able to produce that? I think they can because they had critical mass and they had the drive and they had the vision. Well, Nigeria has great opportunities. It definitely has a critical mass in terms of demographics. You have a lot of consumers, which is great. You have the drive, you have educated people. There's more and more funding coming through. So yes, I think countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, Kenya, I mean, to name a few, but I really think that all across Africa, in all African countries, you could see the surge of giants coming up.
I think diversification and innovation, perhaps we can chunk those.
The tomatoes in
well,
Morocco?
Well,
no,
tomatoes,
I have to agree. I mean, I would definitely not advise to diversify in something that you're not competitive. I mean, last time I went to a conference, this young man said, yeah, my friend, he tried to produce milk in some place or another and it didn't really work for him. Well, the first rule of any business, I mean, check your fundamentals. Are you going to be competitive? If not, just either move your business somewhere else or do another business. So that's the first rule. And of course, if your input is very expensive, so if energy cost is very high or if water cost is very high, then maybe you need to look at what can you truly be competitive. Now, also you need to take sometimes a midterm approach because sometimes, for example, things like energy may cost a little high today, but there could be investments that are being done, like building new hydropower stations, and in 3-4 years' time, your energy cost is going to be a lot lower. And then you have to judge, can I survive those 3 or 4 years by being slightly less competitive, but I know that in 6 years' time, because my energy source is going to be such low cost, I'm going to make all my money back. And to ask you about what we're doing in terms of diversification and industries. Now, Angola has a very positive legal framework in terms of diversification. So we have a high requirement to incorporate locally produced and locally manufactured goods into an oil and service industry. We recommend around a 50% incorporation, which is a very, very high incorporation. That has allowed for several industries to grow. So we produce umbilicals, which is something quite complex in the oil sector. We produce all kinds of different things for the industry. We also are able to assemble platforms and FPSOs locally, and we can also maintain FPSOs, which again, it's, we have some quite sophisticated shipyards. And yes, that has provided a lot of jobs. Now the challenge is, as you mentioned, once the oil price and the oil sector goes down, what can you do with these industries? Can these industries service other industries? And that's what's important. So not only should we create a cluster that can service your oil and gas, but when we are creating these industrial clusters, can we make sure that they also have other clients that are not oil and gas so that we diversify their risk in terms of a downturn?
And I guess the last question is, how has it felt being a woman, I guess an African woman in a business community that's probably male-dominated and perhaps still racist?
Yeah. Well, there was somebody who asked me about IT, and I have to say, if you gave me a choice to start a company today, I would start an IT company. I was benchmarking Amazon, and you think about Amazon. Amazon, is it an IT company or is it a retailer? It's a digital retailer, which is unbelievable. So today when you look at IT is absolutely in everything. So you can start an IT company and you become a retail company. So if I had to do a business, and I know lots of you like IT and tech, so I would definitely bet on IT solutions. I'm not sure who had that question. It was coming from somewhere here. And in terms of prejudice, yes, it is a challenge. Yeah, women, very hard for women out there. I don't see enough women at the top. I think it's very sad that often I enter board meetings and I'll be the only woman in the board meeting, and sometimes I find that rather unacceptable. But can we do more about it? Yes, we can. I think it has to be somewhat policy-led. I think we have to look at our corporations and our organizations and to see that we need to change practices. We need to have human resource policies at the level of HR, where we really say you have to evaluate women fairly. You cannot discriminate women because she's a mother or because she's expecting a baby and she's not going to be working for 6 months, so all of a sudden she's no longer a valuable asset. So we need to create that through policy. It's not enough just to tell people, you actually have to implement serious policies about that. So.
Great. We're about to get between people in their lunch, but there is a question there.
Hi, my name is Kagwe. I'm from Kenya. I just have a quick question on sovereign wealth funds, especially with respect to Angola. I believe you've got one of the largest wealth funds in Africa. It'd be interesting to just hear your view on some of the elements you touched on with Sonangol. How do you change governance in a lot of the African sovereign wealth funds where you get a lot of headlines when they're started or about to be started, and then you hear nothing? So how do you change the governance and the transparency of these wealth funds? And how do you change the impact these wealth funds have in terms of investing in people, in normal business over the long term?
Correct. We've got a quick question here, and if you could keep it quick, and I'm going to ask you to.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Ali Mabubakri. It's good to see you again.
Hi.
We met at the LSE
Yeah.
a few weeks ago. So my question is on the investment glut in the oil and gas space. As you know, many African countries are oil dependent. Due to the drop in price of oil, has been a paucity of investment in the oil and gas industry. So how can oil and gas countries from Africa that are dependent on oil and gas address this potential challenge waiting to happen? Thank you.
Okay. So just to quickly answer the last question. So sovereign wealth funds and business corporations like Sonangol, we behave slightly differently because we have a different mission. Our mission as a corporate company, as Sonangol, is really to run the company efficiently and to deliver profit to our shareholder, which is the state. And ultimately, we are a business. So our approach has to be a business approach. We're governed by the governance that business is governance. In terms of sovereign wealth funds, they tend to take a longer approach, and some of their investments and some of their positioning are not necessarily just driven by profit. Some of them are driven also by the social benefits that will be created by that investment in a certain community. So in a way, we kind of have different challenges. And to quickly just answer the downturn in oil, it will be a challenge. We are probably facing another 2-3 years of prices being quite soft. So it will not be easy. So it's an opportunity. I think that we have, in some cases, resilience. I think that most African people are quite resilient. We all have a lot of history, and we all come from these backgrounds where we have faced so many challenges in the past in our different countries, whether political challenges or war issues or economic issues. So I think we are quite strong people, and in 2-3 years we'll be definitely in a much better place than we are today.
Isabel, I've got some slightly bad news for you, which is that all of the other speakers, as my last question to them, I've given them a hypothetical $1 million and said, where would you invest it? Since you've already told us you're going to do
I think I
IT, you miss out on the non-existent $1 million. If you would please join me in thanking Isabel for her insights.